All right, so we'll spend the rest of the lesson looking at some of the different parts of the cell, some of the different organelles. This first one here that we're going to look at, the cell membrane, you'll find it in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The rest of them will only find in eucs, because again, prokaryotes are small and simple and don't have any of the rest of them. But the cell membrane, you would find it in both. The structure of the cell membrane, what it looks like, again, you can see a picture down here. We say that it's made of what's called a lipid bilayer. So you see down here in my picture these little brown parts, and you can see there's two layers of them. So there's a layer up here on the top, and let's say this would be outside the cell here, and this would be inside the cell down here. So there's this bilayer, two layers of these little things called lipids. And that's going to be kind of the basic structure of the cell membrane. And that lipid bilayer is thin and flexible. You can almost think of the cell membrane kind of like the skin of the cell. It stretches all the way around the cell. And again, it's kind of a thin, flexible covering, again, going all the way around the cell. Now you'll notice that there are some other things as well with that lipid bilayer. It's mainly made up of that lipid bilayer. So if I were to ask you a quiz question about the structure of the cell membrane, again, the key words you'd be looking for there is that lipid bilayer. There's two layers of these little things called lipids. But you can also see some other things, some proteins, some carbohydrates that are stuck to that lipid bilayer and on that lipid bilayer, and in some cases all the way through the lipid bilayer from one side to the other. And those will be important to us a little bit later on. We talk a little bit more about how the cell membrane does its job, but it's mainly made of this lipid bilayer, but there's some other stuff in there as well. All right? And then the job of the cell membrane, its function, again, you can kind of think of it like the skin of the cell, and its primary job is going to be to control what enters and leaves the cell. What gets to come in and what gets to go out is going to be determined by that cell membrane. That's its job. So it stretches all the way around the cell. If something's going to go into or out of the cell, it's going to have to go through that cell membrane. So it controls what enters and leaves the cell. It also offers a little bit of protection for the cell, for the parts of the cell that are on the inside of that cell membrane. Okay? So again, the cell membrane's structure is going to be this lipid bilayer. Again, it's going to stretch all the way around the cell, and it is going to control what gets to come into the cell and what gets to go out of the cell. Okay? There's the cell membrane. Next up, we have the nucleus of the cell, and you can see a picture of the nucleus here. Now, this picture is sort of a cross section. It's like it's been sliced. A real nucleus is not going to have this chunk taken out of it, but in this little cartoonish drawing, they've taken a slice so that we can see kind of down inside the nucleus and see what it looks like on the inside. But if we look at that structure of that nucleus, it's usually going to be fairly round, fairly large in comparison to the rest of the cell parts. And it's usually going to be kind of centrally located. Located kind of in the middle of the cell. And again, that structure there will tie into its function here in just a second. You'll see that the nucleus here has this little purple covering kind of going around the outside of it. So it's got its own little membrane that separates it from the rest of the cell, from the cytoplasm. So that membrane that goes around the nucleus, we'll call that the nuclear membrane. Sometimes you'll see it in textbooks or websites referred to as the nuclear envelope. So the envelope kind of surrounds a letter. This membrane kind of surrounds the nucleus. So we've got the nuclear membrane, and then oftentimes you'll see this darker spot in the middle, and that part's called the nucleolus. Right? So there's the structure of the nucleus. Now the job of the nucleus you're probably familiar with already. Um, it's going to control most of what's going on in the cell. The nucleus is going to send messages out to the rest of the cell so that the other little parts of the cell know what to do and kind of when to do it. It stores the DNA, so in our picture here you might be able to see some little squiggly lines in there. That's the artist's representation of that DNA. And it keeps that DNA in two different forms. If that DNA is being used, then we call it chromatin. It's this kind of long thread-like um, piece of DNA, which is what you're seeing over here. If the cell is getting ready to divide, it'll take that chromatin, those long thread-like structures, and kind of wind them up and wrap them up into some little X-shaped structures that we can actually see under the microscope. When the DNA is in this chromatin form, like it is here, we can't see those things with microscopes. But when it gets into that chromosome form, when that chromatin gets all packed up into those nice, neat little X-shaped structures, we can actually see those through the microscope, through our microscopes, and we may do that later on. All right, so we got the DNA is in here in the middle, and the DNA is actually the instructions for what the cell is supposed to do, and so the nucleus houses those instructions and then sends out messages to the different parts of the cell. So again, that's why it's very important that it's kind of located in the center of the cell. Okay? So there's the nucleus. Oh, the nucleolus, this little part here, a lot of times we get questions about, what's that part do? And the nucleolus is going to be where the little parts of the ribosomes get made. So the ribosomes are another cell part that we'll talk about in just a minute. They are very, very important. And the nucleolus is kind of, they make the parts that end up making the ribosomes. So the ribosomes actually get put together outside the nucleus, but the little parts that make up the ribosomes are produced in the nucleolus. That's its job. All right. So moving on, next up is the endoplasmic reticulum. And so in our picture over here of the endoplasmic reticulum, you see it's got this shape here. And you'll also notice that it looks like, this is just a section of the endoplasmic reticulum. It would go all the way around here. But if you go back and look at our picture of the nucleus here, if you see this little part right here sticking out from the nucleus, this is actually part of the endoplasmic reticulum. So the nucleus would sit right here, and the endoplasmic reticulum would wrap all the way around it, and then just kind of extend off in all different directions from that nucleus. Its structure is going to be a system of membranes with many folds. So it's like a membrane that's been folded up and stacked on top of itself over and over and over again. So it's going to be kind of the main structure of the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER, by the way. You don't ever have to say endoplasmic reticulum. If I ask you a question and the answer to it's endoplasmic reticulum, you can put ER and that'll be just fine. All right? Now we got two different types of endoplasmic reticulum that we see. We have rough ER and smooth ER, and the basic difference is that the rough ER has bumps and the smooth ER doesn't. So the rough ER has these little things called ribosomes. We'll look at those ribosomes in just a second, that are going to be stuck to the sides of it. And the smooth ER doesn't have those little ribosomes stuck to it. So it's pretty easy to tell the difference between rough ER and smooth ER. This picture down here makes them look a little bit more different than maybe what they really do. But the main difference is that these little black dots that you see here, these are going to be the ribosomes. And they're going to be on the rough ER. They're going to look like little bumps on the rough ER, and the smooth ER doesn't have those. All right. The main job for the endoplasmic reticulum, its main function, is it's a transportation system. So if we look at the picture here, you can almost see the little passageways that are formed by those folds in that membrane system, and again, that's going to extend off in all directions from the nucleus, and it's going to transport, again, mainly proteins around within the cell. And that's going to be mainly the job of the rough ER to do that, to transport those proteins around throughout the cell. The smooth ER, its main job is going to be to kind of make the parts that make up the cell membrane. So if the cell membrane gets damaged, or a new section of cell membrane needs to be made, that's going to be produced in the smooth ER. But again, the main function for the ER, the one that I really want you guys to remember, is that the endoplasmic reticulum is a transportation system within the cell. It's like almost like a set of passageways inside the cell, or sometimes you'll see it compared to like a moving sidewalk or a conveyor belt within the cell. So proteins get into those passageways and get moved around to wherever they need to go within the cell. So that's the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER. We've mentioned this guy several times already, so let's talk about him. But the ribosomes are very, very important. This would be one single ribosome here. Most of the time, though, you're not going to see a single ribosome. This little part here, I've had students before say it kind of looks like a piece of bubble gum stuck to a comb. I guess if it were either a really, really, really big piece of bubble gum or a really small comb, that might be true. But really what we would see is this sort of comb section would be stretched on out here, and you would see several of these kind of glob-shaped things stuck to that. So when we look at the structure, we say that it's got a bead-like structure. And again, you may look at that thing and say, well, it doesn't look like much of a bead, but again, you're probably going to see several of those kind of linked up in one big long row. So it kind of looks like a string of beads. It's going to be the structure for the ribosomes. Sometimes, again, most of the time, you'll find them attached to the ER, so like we just talked about. And of course, if they're attached to the ER, that would be rough ER. Or they can be found just floating around freely on their own in the cytoplasm. So they can be stuck to the sides of the ER or off by themselves elsewhere in the cell. Now, the job of the ribosomes, its function, is going to be extraordinarily important because, again, we said back at the beginning of this, the key point was that proteins make the cell go around. They're the main goal of the cell is to make and use proteins. Well, the ribosome is the place where those proteins get made. So the nucleus is going to send out instructions to the ribosomes, telling the ribosomes which proteins to make. The ribosomes are then going to put those proteins together. They're going to produce those proteins. And now again, if we think back to structure and function being related to each other, the ribosomes make those proteins. And we usually find them attached to the ER. And if we think back to what the ER did, what its job was, what its function was, well, we can go back and look at that. The main job for the ER was to transport the proteins. So it kind of makes sense that, yeah, we'd have these little ribosomes that make the proteins stuck right on the sides of the transportation system. So those ribosomes are going to make those proteins, and the proteins are going to move immediately right into the transportation system, the ER. The ER is going to move those proteins to wherever they need to go within the cell. So again, structure and function related to each other. Okay. There we have the ribosomes.